game, and then Marshall got on a roll at about the 10-minute mark of the second half, pulled away. They do. They got two really nice guards that are like were like preseason in the Sun Belt, preseason all over the Sun Belt. Second, third team. Well, here's how they set up the arena.
Do I?
Here's how they set the arena up. First 5 rows cordoned off, and then they had everybody spaced going up from there. And the bleachers in the end zones, they had them tarped off for advertisements.
Mm.
We're a little past time to get started, but that's okay. We're taking our time as we started our study in the book of Deuteronomy. For those, we know there were a few that weren't here last week, just kind of review some of the things that we experienced. We learned that the book of Deuteronomy basically is a Greek title for this book, and it basically means the second law or the second telling of the law. And also other translations call it the words. And basically what we have here are 3 sermons and 2 poems that are authored by Moses as the children of Israel have reached the precipice of the promised land. They have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and they've reached the point where they're preparing to cross the Jordan River. And we think that this was written about 1426 BC. Most of the scholars agree that's about the time that this was written, about the time that the crossing of the Jordan River took place and about the time, obviously, when Moses died at the age of 120, and they're camped in the area of Moab. The Moabites land is where they were located, and this is the area just east of the Jordan River. And their wanderings have taken them through the Sinai Peninsula, through the desert. And as we discovered last week, if they had been obedient, they could have had a more direct route from the south into the Promised Land. But because of their disobedience, their entry into the Promised Land was delayed because of the wanderings in the wilderness, and they end up going a little farther east and then west, but finally they are at the point where they are ready to cross into the Promised Land. But Moses has some words to say, and as we discussed last Lord's Day, these words were very much important to the future of the children of Israel. He basically was giving them a warning. This was a warning about their survival. He said, you heed the words of the law, you obey the law, you heed the words I say, the counsel I give you, and this nation shall live. You'll take the Promised Land, and you'll take all these things that God has told them to walk in and take. But if you disobey, you face captivity, you face the loss of the Promised Land, you face relocation to other nations, you face destruction, and you face death. Moses, in these words in Deuteronomy, is giving them a choice. And unfortunately, as we know through the history of the Old Testament, they did not always make the right choice, the proper choice. And it cost the nation. It cost them time. It cost them treasure. And that's what Moses is basically telling them. We're going to pick up this morning with verse 7. After we got through most of our introduction last Lord's Day, we got up through verse 6. So basically, Moses is using this first chapter to relive a little bit of history. And he went into the commands that the Lord had given them about when it was time to leave Mount Sinai, when the law had been delivered to him and to them. At one point he says, it's time to leave. It's time to move. So this is when they picked up their tents. They picked up the tabernacle, which we discussed so thoroughly in the book of Exodus. They would pick up all the items of the tabernacle, and they moved on. And they kept traveling over these 40 years, and this scene was repeated constantly about setting up, settling down, then picking up and moving on. So we will pick up this Lord's Day with verse 7 before we have our discussion. Let's bow for a word of prayer. David Cottle, would you pray for us, please? All right, verse 7 reads, turn and take your journey and go to the mountains of the Amorites, to all the neighboring places in the plain, in the mountains and in the lowland, in the south and on the seacoast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, what we have described here is the area that God intended for them to take as the Promised Land, the area that was going to be occupied by them. As we know from history, they did not occupy all of it. The disobedience, sin caused them at times to decide to not go as far and instead get comfortable, intermingle with idol worshipers. And so they didn't take all this land that God told them to take. But this area would be, obviously, as described here, very large. Now, it was much larger than any area that the children of Israel had possessed as yet. They'd been very much of a nomadic, camp-like existence, a large camp, but a very camp-like existence. But now they're being told, you take nations. You take the land of nations, not just a small area where you might settle. Even during the time of David and Solomon, the greatness of King David and Solomon, Israel did not possess as much land as God was giving them here in his proclamation through Moses. And again, this territory was so large that it included all the area from the Nile, the river of Egypt, to the great river Euphrates, one of the other great rivers of the world. And when was this promise initially made? Or who was it made to? Abraham. Abraham was who it was originally made to, and it goes back to the 15th chapter of Genesis and verse 18, when as part of his covenant with Abraham, he said, you're going to possess all of this. You're going to have all this. I promise you, as long as you and your people serve me. Now, after some time, the hilly area where the Amorites lived became the central part of Judah and Mount Ephraim. The Jordan Valley was called the Arabah. This area extended south from the Sea of Galilee. And this basically was the area where they originally were supposed to have gone into the Promised Land. Now this area called the Arabah went past the Dead Sea to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the tip end, if you look at modern day Israel, is the tip end of the Red Sea, which Israel occupies, modern day Israel. Now the hills and the plains were the area to the west of the hilly country where the Amorites lived. And of course we know that they'd had some run-ins with the Amorites, which God helped them defeat. This area of the Amorites included the low hills called the Shephelah and the plain all the way to the Mediterranean coast. Again, this is such a wide area they're being called to take. The south country was the Negev Desert, which sometimes we also call the Sinai area today. This was to be taken and to be possessed by God's people. Now the Negev is a dry region to the south of the hilly country. The coast was there was a coast area as well, of course, on the very southeast point of the Mediterranean Sea. So all this we're describing here was called the area of the Canaanites. The Canaanite nations possessed this land. To the north of the Canaanite country, the Israelites would possess what we call today Lebanon. In fact, if you look at the map, they were to possess about 2/3 of modern-day Lebanon. And to the north and to the east, their territory went all the way to the Euphrates River. A wide area God gave them, and he tells them, take it. It's there for the asking. But they did not take it all. But you see here what God is offering them. It's an amazing land. They'll have land to set up, to survive, to live, to set up a permanent presence. But because of their stiff-neckedness, all this land was not taken as God had directed. What they do take is significant. But it wasn't as much as God was giving them, or God was offering them, all for their faith, all for their loyalty to him, all part of the agreement he had reached with them, going all the way back to Abraham, the covenant. The covenant guaranteed this to a faithful children of Israel. Let's look at verse 8. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them and their descendants after them. So God was the one who chose this area for Israel. The Lord promised to the ancestors all the way back to Abraham that he would give them this territory and give it to their descendants. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't see it. It was many years, it was centuries down the road from their lives. But the promise was there, and God was not going to break this promise. God was willing and wanted to give this land to his people that he was in a covenant relationship with. However, it was up to them to show their faith and go in and physically take the land. They had to physically grab it. God was not going to just hand it to them on a silver platter. They had to physically walk in, fight for it with God's help in some cases, but take the land. And they must obey the laws of the covenant. In other words, to maintain the blessings that God was giving them, they must maintain that covenant relationship. They must make the sacrifices, obey the law, act within the law that had been given back at Mount Sinai. But, as we know from history, they did not possess all the territory God gave them and told them to take because of their disobedience. And the pages of the Old Testament are filled with chapter and verse of their acts of disobedience. But at this point, they seem to be a willing people. They seem to be a people willing to take all that God was giving them, and they would physically make the move to take it. Well, let's move on. And it's time to look at where they select leaders here. And let's look at verses 9 through 13. Moses writes, "And I spoke to you at that time, saying, I alone am not able to bear you. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and here you are today as the stars of heaven in multitude. May the Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times more numerous than you are, and bless you as he has promised you. How can I alone bear your problems and your burdens and your complaints? Choose wise, understanding, and knowledgeable men from among your tribes, and I will make them heads over you." So before the Israelites had left Sinai, Moses was the only leader, the only judge among the people. He didn't have assistants. He had certainly his brother Aaron and Aaron's family as far as the priesthood was concerned, but as far as making other judgment decisions or judgment rulings, it was all in the hands of Moses. But Moses understands it's getting unwieldy to be a one-man show to guide a growing nation while they're in the wilderness, especially in this early period that is being described here. There's much growth as far as the numbers in families. Population is growing. The nation's becoming a little unwieldy for Moses to govern alone. Too many problems for Moses to deal with by himself. And what that meant, apparently, from morning to evening, people were bringing their problems to Moses. It was a constant, almost a assembly line of people approaching Moses, asking for judgments, asking for decisions, asking for advice. And we even go back to Exodus 18, which we studied, and remember that his father-in-law, Jethro, saw this happening. Remember, he had come from Midian to visit with Moses and the people. And he said, "Moses, you've taken too much upon yourself. You need help." He had told Moses that time it was too much for him. And he told Moses, appoint other men to take the work from you. We saw this in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 26. Well, Moses eventually follows the advice of his father-in-law, Jethro. And Moses says in what we just read that, yes, the population of the children of Israel had increased. He used the term in other places that they were as the stars in the sky. There were that many people when we look in the sky and see the stars at night and can't number them. There's so many. And the Lord had told Abraham to look up and see the stars. This was back in Genesis chapter 15. Abraham and the Lord speaking. God had promised at that time to Abraham that the descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky. Again, when he was making this covenant relationship with Abraham. And of course, this was a little bit of hyperbole, but what it meant that there would be a vast number of people in God's family, among God's people. A lot of people. Now, someone's calculated that the human eye could see about 3,000 stars. That's about the scope of our vision, peripherally and direct. But there would be many times more Israelites than that, we know. And Moses prayed that God would even increase the people just that much more to occupy this upcoming promised land. And Moses declared the situation of the people about needing help. He told them that he could not deal with all their problems. He couldn't deal with their troubles and their quarrels, which he had to constantly hear of every day. When you have that many people, you're going to have some people that rub against each other. And they don't get along. It wasn't one big happy family. You know, some people might want to portray the children of Israel just one big happy traveling family, kind of like if you remember back in the 60s when you had those hippie families kind of traveling around. No, the children of Israel weren't just some happy traveling hippie family. They were people who had constant battles with each other over land, over items, over personal matters. Moses said, I need help. I've been convinced I need help. It's too much for one man to do. So he told them, select suitable men from each tribe to be their judges. We learned this back in Exodus. And Moses said that he would make these men tribal leaders. We're going to break it down on a tribal basis to decide these issues and not have to bring them up to Moses, or bring all of them up to Moses. Verse 14, and you answered me and said, the thing which you have told us to do is good. Israel agreed. We'll appoint these other men to be our leaders. Let's do it. And they probably realized, as Moses explained, how unwieldy a situation this is and was. And so they knew some changes needed to be made. Verse 15, so I took the heads of your tribes, wise and knowledgeable men, and made them heads over you, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, leaders of 10s, and officers for your tribes. Now, apparently names came to Moses in this process. People suggested, well, this person would be a good leader. They're intelligent, they have respect among the people, and they'd be good. And as the scripture tells us, they led different sizes. You had a dividing of responsibility. Some led small groups, some led large groups. But they were given what they could handle due to their ability or according to their ability. If they could oversee 10 people, that's good. Maybe they didn't have the ability to oversee 50 people, but we've had somebody in the tribe who could oversee 50 people, and they were given the job. And these men had wisdom. They had experience as they were appointed. You didn't have idiots that were given these jobs. You didn't have men that got these jobs because they had pull politically. Moses knew who to appoint. God, no doubt, helped guide him in who to appoint. And these men didn't only have the ability and the responsibility to decide these disagreements. They also probably had a military function as well. And they would be able to lead these groups. And again, their ability to lead either small or large groups probably had a military purpose. And they would direct men in battle when need be. And as we know, they had instances of battle in the wanderings in the wilderness, especially with the Amorites, who were really antagonistic toward God's people and fought them all the way. Now, Israel did not have a regular army, but when they needed to call men up from the tribes to fight, they had this ability, and they had built-in leadership now to lead these men. And we know from Scripture that every man 20 years and up was expected to serve in a military area.
Well, if you look at this is almost the way that the army is organized.
Yeah.
From the battalion level on down.
It's all down to your platoon.
Down to the squad.
Exactly. They have different purposes. They had the leaderships had different capabilities. I don't think I'd want Sergeant Carter running the entire Marine Corps, but Sergeant Carter did really well with Gomer and the guys in the platoon. So they had their place and they had their position. And God saw to it, and Moses saw to it, that everybody was suitable for the job assigned to them. And not only do you have men of military, we go to verse 16, and there's another purpose. Then I commanded your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your brethren, and judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the stranger who is with him. So Moses appoints these judges, apparently on, once again, a tribal basis. And they had a legal function. These were the deciders. These were the men who needed to use a little bit of common sense, a little bit of wisdom, and the law to make decisions, settle what was right in arguments among themselves in the tribes. And Moses said, don't be favoring one over the other. You need to be neutral down the line when you hear a case. Be fair in your judgments. And he said that don't favor just your brethren of Israel, but if foreigners bring a case, you be fair to the foreigner, a non-Jew, non-Israelite, whoever's in the camp and has a disagreement, whoever's involved in a disagreement, you be fair, you judges. So we have judges and tribal leaders now put in place. Verse 17, we continue on the judges. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid in any man's presence, for the judgment is God's. The case that is too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it. So the judges, again, must be fair, strictly fair, neutral, as the case is brought to them. And judges should not look upon one who was wealthier than another and favor them. Have respect for all. That's a big word, respect. Respect everyone that comes before you, and then judge fairly, judge righteously. Someone who was more prominent than others should not have an advantage in front of these judges on a tribal basis. And the judges must not be bribed, and also they must be fearless. You know, you're going to step on a toe maybe with a righteous ruling. Don't be afraid to do so, because you would have Moses backing, and you would have God's backing as you make these good judgments. Now, in God's law, in even Old and New Testament, we see that all people are equal. And in these cases, judges were acting on behalf of not only Moses, but God himself. And these judges, their final responsibility was to God. They had to be making right decisions, act righteously and according to God's law. And we find out that there was a final arbiter. We had a Supreme Court in the children of Israel, and the Supreme Court's name was Moses. Because if they were unhappy with either the decision that was made, or if these judges said, I just cannot make this decision, they sent it up the line to Moses. And Moses finally would be able to solve the problem. Now, he now had a lot of the judicial yoke taken off of him, so he would have times to make final judgment on these cases or on these situations. So we're getting a good setup here of how the camp was to work. Philip?
These judges, when they were appointed head over the tribe, no doubt that a lot of these people were relatives.
Yeah.
So it's hard to judge.
Yeah.
These may be some of the cases that they were sitting on Moses.
You're asking a lot of these guys. Again, they're probably going to step on some toes. And they might lose face in the family if they make a judgment that's not too popular. So if these people are unhappy, Moses is the final say. And Moses gets the opportunity. So in essence, Moses was the Supreme Court of the children of Israel. But he had now, with these appointments, the time to do this. He didn't have to waste his time day after day from sun up to sundown hearing these disagreements, hearing these arguments. There was a good distribution of authority among the people. Verse 18, and I commended you at that time all things that you should do. Again, Moses speaking here. He said that Moses at the time explained this while they were in the wilderness. He told them what they should do, and it was so important that they obey the whole law, that they keep the law. And so that their job was given. Their job was given. They knew their responsibilities. They knew the law. The law had been given to them through Moses by God. And they had to act accordingly. Use wisdom, use good sense, and to act righteously. So Moses has the system set up on a tribal basis. They have men to lead groups of different sizes. They have not only a judicial system, but as we explained, probably a military system as well. They would be ready to go out into battle when time has come. And they had leaders who not only had these judicial requirements, but had these military requirements and talents as well. Any other thoughts as we get through verse 18? Well, let's head to verse 19. And we have some of the stiff-neckedness that starts to show among the people. Moses says in verse 19, so we departed from Horeb, Sinai, and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as the Lord our God had commanded us. Then we came to Kadesh Barnea. So the Lord told the Israelites, you leave Sinai. It's time to move. Let's pick up. And they went to this place called Kadesh Barnea. At this point, they did what the Lord told them to do. So how far did they travel? Well, from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea was about a 100-mile journey, a wilderness journey. It was a hard journey across the desert. This was not a green, pleasant travel. They were out in the desert traveling to Kadesh Barnea, this 100-mile journey. And it would take them about 11 days. They could only get a little under 10 miles a day travel, most of the scholars estimate. So it would be about an 11-day journey. Now, beyond Kadesh Barnea was the hilly country where the Amorites lived. And these are the people that will not cooperate with God's people as they journey. Let's look at verses 20 and 21. And I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. Look, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and possess it, as the Lord God of your fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear or be discouraged. So they had this 100-mile journey, and they're approaching the land of the Amorites. And Moses tells them, take this land. God's given you this land. They'd reached this hilly country where the Amorites lived. And they were at the southern boundary of the land of the Amorites. And this was an area that God said you're going to take. This is yours, Israel. And it's time to take it now. Don't delay. But I'm not just going to hand it to you without some effort. Show your faith by physically walking in and taking this land, God's telling them. Go and possess the country, possess the land. And what does that mean? Well, you know what? You're going to have to fight for your land. Israel was going to have to physically fight the inhabitants of the land of the Amorites to take this land. And this was asking something new of the children of Israel. They'd been a wandering people, but they'd not been a fighting people. God had, to this point, not asked them to fight while they were wandering after being in Egyptian captivity. They'd been blessed by God. They'd been protected by God, even after they had disobeyed with the golden calf incident. God still loved and protected them. And now he's giving them this land, but you got to take it. You've got to go in and fight the inhabitants to take it. And we don't know what kind of an army Israel could have brought, but we know they had God fighting for them. That's the important part. God was there doing most of the fighting for them as long as they were faithful, but we don't know what kind of an army they would have. We don't know the weapons they might have had. Probably pretty rudimentary. And also, they didn't know what any details about the Amorites. They didn't have army intelligence back in those days, so they didn't have an idea of what a battleground would be, the size of the army of the Amorites. So there was a lot of unknowns. But Moses told them, don't be anxious, don't be afraid. Take the land, because the Lord is giving you this territory. And this is just the start. Just the start. And they must trust the Lord and go on. Move on. Verse 22. And every one of you came near to me and said, let us send men before us, and let them search out the land for us, and bring back word to us of the way by which we should go up, and of the cities into which we shall come. So now we get this idea of a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of spying, that the people want to take place. The people didn't want to go into battle without knowledge of their opponent. Know your enemy. Kind of sounds like one of those World War II training films that they would play before the guys, or when the guys went into the military, and it was kind of part of the indoctrination. Well, they wanted to know their enemy as this situation takes place. They were probably a little anxious, maybe a little afraid. So they come to Moses with this proposal, and they say, send some men into this country before we fight them to know what we're facing. And these men can provide the information that we need, and then we can choose our approach with that knowledge. So they're a little bit anxious. And we'll wrap up with verse 23. The plan pleased me well. So I took 12 of your men, one man from each tribe. So this was reasonable to Moses. And Moses, he also, no doubt, had consultation with Jehovah about this. And we know that the Lord told him, in Numbers, and we read this in Numbers 13, the Lord told him to send men into Canaan. He said, one from each tribe, 12 men. And Moses chose the 12 men. And the book of Numbers records the names of those men. That's in Numbers chapter 13, verses 4 through 16. David, I'll leave you at verse 24, brother.